Thanks very much for having me today, folks. Appreciate the invite. I'm going to talk a bit about a vision for independence, but strip it back to how we get there, because I think that's more important. When I was asked to provide a title for this talk, I called it Putting Scotland's Future in Scotland's Hands. Today, 11 years after the independence referendum, it's a familiar phrase. In fact, it's a phrase so familiar that it appeared in countless SNP conference speeches in Aberdeen. It appears on election literature every few years. In fact, it's a slogan so familiar that in 2025, it's devoid of any real meaning. Once, these 6 words held promise. They encapsulated the hopes of a generation who, in 2014, eyed an opportunity to determine their own prospects, to take back control of our own destiny, not simply in the form of national independence, but popular sovereignty. They embodied a common view of where and with whom power, be that social, economic, or political, should lie in Scotland. Yes, the British state was viewed by most as the primary obstacle to the realisation of democratic renewal, but opposition to that state had come to symbolise so much more, namely a rejection of the economic doctrines which shattered social bonds, lowered living standards, and alienated Scots from one another. In this climate, to truly put Scotland's future in Scotland's hands was to defy not only the UK government, but to confront the faceless forces of the market which sought to monopolise our every waking hour. That, however, could not be said to be the motivation of those who deploy the slogan today. Even then, the phrase, when spoken by senior politicians, was accompanied by important caveats. London, Brussels, and Washington were to respectively retain a share of Scotland's sovereignty. In 2025, these are no longer caveats. It seems to offshore, outsource, and deny democratic control of the political and economic realm has become the organising principle of government in Scotland. From Edinburgh and London, the Scottish Government is actively taking Scotland's future out of Scotland's hands. So deeply ingrained is this problem that, I would argue, to articulate a vision for independence without first confronting the capture of Scotland's very own political class is only to entrench the challenges we face at present. Friends, Scotland is for sale in an auction rubber-stamped by Holyrood. The resources and institution of our nation are being privatised at a rate so accelerated that many hardly notice it. Scotland's offshore wind, among the greatest in Europe, leased to the world's largest corporations. Those ScotWind shares, not owned by BP, Shell, and SSE, belong to asset managers like BlackRock, who own a controlling stake in 15 of 20 projects. In 2023, Scotland's trees were privatised in the largest PFI deal since the Scottish Parliament convened, a £2 billion plan for nature restoration signed alongside a Swiss bank by a Scottish Green government minister. To the delight of private capital, 2 green-free ports have appeared on Scotland's coast. These subnational tax havens function without any democratic oversight and operate as effective playgrounds for big business. The arrival of their ugly sibling, the Scottish Investment Zone, to Glasgow and Aberdeen means that the most productive parts of our economy sit under special measures. Meanwhile, the Scottish National Investment Bank, once the great hope of economic development, awarded £50 million in 2021 to Gresham House, an asset management firm with £8 billion of assets under management and Scotland's second largest landowner. This summer, the National Records of Scotland awarded a contract worth £75,000 to Deloitte. The publicly run agency enlisted the Big Four consultancy firm to begin preparing for the 2031 Scottish census, absent any competitive tendering process. Since the Doomsday Book of 1086, the British state has been able to count its own people. In Scotland, however, this task now requires the assistance of a scandal-ridden company compelled to pay £15 million by the UK's Financial Reporting Council as a penalty as recently as 2020. These are just some select examples that help make Scotland one of Europe's most foreign-owned economies, and every one of them has been backed to the hilt by those who claim to stand up for Scotland in Edinburgh and London. So a litany of core state functions critical to the creation of any independent state now sit in private hands. When SNP government ministers have to make a decision, they hire a private consultant to make it for them. In this term of the Scottish Parliament, one would struggle to find a policy initiative that didn't have the fingerprints of KPMG, Deloitte, PwC all over it. So by relying so heavily on the private sector, Scottish ministers seek to absolve themselves of responsibility. The Scottish economy in their conception should not be subject to democratic debate, but rather managed by sensible people in city centre offices. This approach, which intensified following the referendum in 2014, has hollowed out not only the state, but our national movement. Today, it's an ideology that needs intellectual inspiration, strangled as it has been by that management culture that is so clear in Holyrood. Such a political culture has also served to stymie any vision for independence that exists outside of Glasgow or Edinburgh. We've responded to the defeat of the campaign in 2014 by courting global celebrity. Scotland, so the argument went, was a state and waiting, and so should behave like one by staking out our place in the global order. Scottish hubs opened in Brussels, Berlin, and Washington. Nicola Sturgeon broke America with appearances on The Daily Show, press conferences with Nancy Pelosi on Capitol Hill, and selfies with AOC. The domestic front of this mission focused on attracting multinational capital to Glasgow and Edinburgh, which were to take their places among the cities of the European continent. The rest of the country, however, was largely left behind in a vision for independence which fitted the Isle of Arran, Dunfermline, Fife, largely forgotten. And this, I believe, is more than anything else the source of the paralysis which today grips Scottish politics and the national movement more broadly. 60 years ago, Perry Anderson and Tom Nairn argued that the decline of colonialism would spell the end for the British state. Nationalism, they argued, would emerge in peripheral areas like Scotland, the affluence of which was no longer sustained by the profits of colonial and then neo-colonial development. For a long time, they looked to be right. However, while the discovery of North Sea oil in Scotland precipitated a major breakthrough for Scottish nationalism at the ballot box, it also preceded the arrival of American multinational corporations and foreign direct investment. This accelerated the process, already underway thanks to the sizable US military footprint in Scotland, which would unhitch Scotland from the coattails of one declining empire and subordinate us to the interests of an ascendant alternative. The breakup of Britain envisioned by Nairn and Anderson has been delayed, for the moment, by the gradual incorporation of Scotland and our political representatives into the Washington consensus. You see it everywhere you look. Look at the number of Scottish MSPs and Scottish MSP staff who train in one capacity or another in America. Where once among both the elites and the masses of the Scottish population, the leading stake in the transatlantic trade abated the rise of Scottish nationalism, today the promise of corporate investment and a seat at the table in a US-led world ameliorates any appetite to realise Scotland's real sovereignty. When George Robertson said that devolution would kill Scottish nationalism stone dead, he was derided. However, today, as the SNP prepare to begin a third decade in power, what part of their prospective programme could be said to put the national, i.e. the interests of the great majority of Scotland's population, first? I think this is the difference between the world with which Nairn and Anderson dealt with and the world we're in today. The returns of British colonial extraction were used in part to abate popular discontent in Scotland by rising living standards. However, as workers in Grangemouth know all too well, globalised neoliberalism offers little but decline for Scotland's working class. This contradiction between a Scottish elite desperate to live out its West Wing fantasy and a country where a record number of children reside in temporary housing is critical to rebuilding the case for Scottish independence, democracy and popular sovereignty more broadly. Work as if you live in the early days of a better nation. Remember that. It's inscribed on the Canongate wall. Earlier this month, 18 years after he first became a Scottish Government minister, John Swinney said that Scotland had reached the limits of devolution. He was speaking in Edinburgh's National Portrait Gallery, just metres from where Alistair Gray's drawings hang. He implicitly conceded in that statement that the ambitions of 2 decades prior to work as if we live in the early days of a better nation had long since evaporated. He was launching the latest in a lengthy series of SNP government independence papers. His admission was framed as an argument for self-government, but the 91-page document, A Fresh Start for Independence, is anything but. Devolution has not reached its limits, far from it. Those tasked with administering it may well have reached theirs. In Edinburgh, politicians compete to manage decline from a parliament which has become the opposite of what Donald Dewar intended. Talk about a means to an end. It's an end in itself. Today, if anything unites Holyrood's parties, it's their common inability to articulate a distinct national vision. Parochialism thrives in place of ideology as the business of community councils is elevated to Scottish Government-sponsored summits. Our political class is exhausted, and the roots of its exhaustion lie in the very nature of devolution. Holyrood is in so many ways an end-of-history parliament. It's a product, of course, of the early Blair years. Scotland's present constitutional settlement was conceived at the height of third-way neoliberalism, and so inevitably absorbed a number of its core tenets. The Scottish Parliament retains a strong centralising instinct. It's long blurred the lines between the state and civil society, adopting a culture of endless consultations which place stakeholders on an equal footing and ignore class relations. While failing to use its limited powers to shape Scotland's economy, the Parliament has consistently mothballed major political reforms for fear of upsetting the consensus-based model on which it prides itself. Ultimately, Holyrood was forged in a political moment which no longer exists. The politicians caderised in its environment were raised to believe that ideological contestation was a thing of the past. They lacked the ability, never mind the appetite, to contemplate the return of political confrontation in the changing world. So instead, they shy away from it. They find other ways to keep themselves busy, namely by organising seagull summits or attempting to ban alcohol advertising on pint glasses. Devolution's stagnation is not distinct from the paralysis that grips the independence movement. We can escape this malaise and leave behind the mediocrity, but we need to articulate what it really means to put Scotland's future in Scotland's hands. Only a successful rejuvenation of that politics, and consequently a reorientation of the national movement towards questions of democracy, ownership and power, can hope to re-establish the popular legitimacy essential to any future independence campaign. The stakes are high. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.